Hello, Matthews Gatos here. In this video, we're going to complete the square of a general form quadratic and then solve it and show that results in the quadratic formula. So first of all, we have a general form quadratic, y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, and I'm going to start by completing the square. So the very first thing I have to do, I'm going to follow the same process that I do with numbers. So the first thing I have to do is factor whatever's in front of my x squared just from my x terms. So I'm dividing everything by a, leave yourself a little bit of room, plus c. Okay, so following the grid method, x squared is my first term and that goes there. BA is my middle term and I'm going to divide that into two equal pieces. So that'll be b over 2a and b over 2a. So now I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor from x squared. This whole column is x, and from this whole column is also x. And then I take out my leading coefficient, and I take out the sign as well. So since it's positive, I take out a positive. So I can see that it's going to factor as x plus b over 2a plus x times x plus b over 2a. So to figure out what is going to complete the square, I just multiply b over 2a by itself to get b squared over 4a squared. So inside the brackets, I'm going to add b squared over 4a squared and also subtract b squared minus 4a squared. So remember, that is just 0, and you can add 0 to anything. So I'm going to now focus just on my perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to do my little loop-de-loop on the outside. I want to take this on the outside, which is a times negative b squared over 4a squared. So let me just work that out with you first. So I'll put that over 1 to make it a little easier. So I'm going to multiply negative b squared by a. So that's ab squared all over 4a squared. And then I can simplify. If I have 1a on the top and 2 on the bottom, it cancels out with one of them. So I'm just left with negative b squared over 4a. So let's go ahead and write that. So I have y equals a x squared plus b over ax plus b squared over 4a squared. Let me just move this down so I have a bit more room. And then we just decided that a times my c value there is negative b squared over 4a, and that will be combined with the c on the outside. And I'm just going to write that as c over 1 so I can create a common denominator. Okay, so focusing on the perfect square, so you see my steps are the same as when I had numbers. So this is my perfect square, which I know from my grid factors as that times that. So I have y equals a times x plus b over 2a all squared. And now I just have to combine like terms on the outside. So I want a common denominator. I'm going to use a common denominator of 4a. So this one's already out of 4a. So here I would multiply top and bottom by 4a, and I would get 4ac. So let's combine those together. We'll try that again. There we are. Okay, so we're going to combine those together. Y equals a times x plus b over 2a all squared minus, or rather I'll write it as plus negative b squared plus 4ac all over 4a. Let's just flip that around. B over 2a squared. And instead of negative b squared plus 4ac, I'm going to write that as 4ac take away b squared. I think that looks a little bit neater. So let me just reanimate everything that I had, and I'll make it bigger so you guys can see the whole thing. So this, there we are, is the first step in my process. Okay? So now that I've completed the square, what I'm going to do is solve it. So let's just take this over to my next page. I'll take this one over here just to make sure I did that right. And we're going to now solve it. Okay, So I just wanted to do this as a quick little check for myself to make sure that I'm good. Ooh, looks like I'm on the right track. Okay, so what we're going to do now is solve. So that's what we practiced when we were completing the square. The next step was solving. So to solve, I want to get whatever my square term is by itself. So I'm going to subtract 4ac, take away b squared over 4a from both sides to get my square term by itself. So that's gone. So I'm left with a times x plus b over 2a all squared equals 2. Now we're subtracting this whole term. So I'm going to subtract it term by term. I'm going to subtract the 4ac and subtract a negative b squared, which becomes a positive b squared. Now again, let's flip that around so that my positive term comes first. So instead of negative 4ac plus b squared, I'll write it as b squared minus 4ac all over 4a. Okay, so to get the square term by itself, I now need to divide both sides by a, and that's gone. Just make this bigger so you guys can follow along nicely. Okay, so I'm left with x plus b over 2a all squared equals b squared minus 4ac over 4a divided by a. If I take this whole fraction and divide it by a, it's like dividing by 4a squared. Okay, so now that I have my square term by itself, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Square root of this side, square root of this side. Remember, when you take the square root, it has to be plus minus. So the square and the squared cancel each other out. So the inverse operation to squaring a number is square rooting a number. So I'm left with x plus b over 2a equals plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4a all over 4a squared. Oh, I think I lost my little c along the way. There we are. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to subtract b over 2a from both sides to get x all by itself. And then I'm just going to tidy up. So remember, we say that the negative number goes first. So negative b over 2a, and then it's plus minus. Now, because it's plus minus and it's a fraction, I'm going to do the square root of my numerator all over the square root of my denominator. And then we can tidy this up a little bit. So I have negative b over 2a plus or minus. So the root of b squared minus 4ac all over, the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of a squared is a. Well, that worked out nicely because now I have a common denominator. And we'll put it all together over the common denominator of 2a. So I have x equals negative b, or opposite b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So you can see by completing the square of a general form quadratic and then solving it, I end up with this equation. And that is actually called the quadratic formula. So what we've done is we have proved that the solution to a general form quadratic is given as x equals opposite b plus minus the root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a, and this is called the quadratic formula. So we can use the quadratic formula by using all of the coefficients a, b, and c of a general form quadratic, plug it into that equation, and get the exact value solutions of any quadratic. So I hope that helped and you understand where the quadratic formula came from.